Now, those who are regular viewers of my channel are probably looking at this and thinking, oh, is this going to be another Lone Ranger where he's going to tell us about how we're all wrong and we misunderstood the movie and the marketing sold us a completely different type of story and yada yada yada. 40-minute analysis, blah blah blah. Well, no. Obviously, the fact that I'm doing a cinematic confession should be a dead giveaway of that, but unlike some films I've talked about in the past that I feel were misjudged and perhaps misconstrued by a lot of my professional counterparts, I don't have any real such excuse for Pan. A lot of the complaints against this quasi-reimagining prequel reboot thing of the popular J.M. Barrie story are actually valid, honestly. Yes, you can really tell that certain scenes and entire sequences were reshot or re-edited. There's a lack of proper character development across the film. Some arcs feel very inconsistent and incomplete, especially when it comes to Peter himself and learning about how to overcome his problems and become the Pan. Some of the CGI isn't quite as good as it could be, especially when we see the CGI Peter that they did, which seriously, it looks like somebody on the production team knew somebody on Polar Express and just borrowed a model from that movie, because it's kind of uncanny how similar it looks. It's got that really rubbery quality to it. And sometimes the music by John Powell, who's normally does a lot of kids' films, can be a little bit too bombastic and overpowering at points. And yet, despite all of that, I walked out of the theater when I saw Pan earlier this week going, you know what? I actually, dare I say, had fun with it? Yeah, that's right, the F word, fun. I actually am not afraid to say that I actually enjoyed myself with Pan, but in a very particular manner that I think probably would have been very different had I not already known certain details about the film going in, such as the whole thing with Nirvana, and the fact that it was re-edited apparently after a not very good screening that Warner Brothers had. They asked Wright to go back and change it, which is why the movie was delayed for a couple of months, because it was originally going to come out in summer, but instead came out in autumn. But here's the deal. I enjoy Pan in the way I enjoy movies like Van Helsing or League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. These are just big-budget farces that you look at them and you say, wow, they didn't really get the source material or didn't do all they could have done. In the case of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, they outright butchered the amazing Alan Moore comics. But yet there's something here that kind of makes them endearing and enjoyable in their own way. Indeed, there are a lot of parallels I find between Van Helsing and Pan, not just because both star Hugh Jackman and both are based off of classic properties that come from the Victorian era, but also in terms of a lot of their mentality and mindset. Both are these big-budget CGI fests that have a lot of really over-the-top crazy action sequences, a lot of really goofy, silly performances, a lot of very on-the-nose, hokey kind of dialogue, and both have these really big, crazy, wild, bombastic scores that just go so far over the top that John Williams would absolutely blush. In essence, it's a twofold situation. As a Peter Pan adaptation, Pan does fall short. I feel like what makes a good version of the Pan story is very much keeping to that sense of childhood and innocence. When you think about it, Peter Pan is one of the few children's stories that actually bothers to examine childhood. A lot of them tend to be just straightforward fantasy stories and crazy adventures, but J.M. Barrie's tale is actually one of the few that actually stops and asks us questions about what does it mean to grow up. When you consider that we mostly think of Peter Pan as a boy in green tights fighting a crazy old man with a hook, you come to realize that's actually fairly smart and actually probably a part of what has made the story so endearing and why so many adults still love it. It makes sense why, for example, Spielberg wanted to make Hook. He really resonated a lot with that material. He, like J.M. Barrie in a lot of his films, does keep that element of childhood innocence and imagination alive. And in Joe Wright's case, you can see that as well. His parents were actually owned a puppet theater, and he loved the story of Pan growing up. To him, you can see why a story like this would resonate and why he'd want to make a movie like this. Indeed, in the previous film that he made, Anna Karenina, there's elements of that stagey sort of magical quality because the film uses a weird sort of magical stage performance to tell the story of Anna Karenina, and it transitions from things like sets and models to the actual locations in Russia. And there's some of that here where there's sort of this sense of the theatrical transcending into this sort of fantastical world, and how there's sort of this heightened reality to it. However, unlike Hook, Pan doesn't make the most of those ideas. If Hook's first two-thirds were really looking into the whole notion of what childhood is, and really what would happen if the boy who never grew up, Pan just has those themes as kind of vague window dressing. Here it's more interested in this generic plot about a chosen one who will save Neverland from the evil Blackbeard, played to hammy perfection by Hugh Jackman, I might add. And you just feel like, what was the point of using this specific story? This could be just any fantasy film about an evil pirate ruling a fantasy land, and you could have really the same characters and story. It just wouldn't have to be affiliated with J.M. Barrie. And I feel like that's its biggest letdown, more than really anything else, because at the end of the day, kind of questionable effects can be forgiven, hammy performances can be forgiven, because again, it's Peter Pan, it's not a story famous for salty. But to me, if you're going to make a Pan film, you need to really look at the question of childhood. What does it mean to be a kid? What is imagination? What is this world that these kids travel to? Why do they stay there? Who is Peter? Why does he never want to grow up? What is this whole thing with mortality? There's a lot of stuff to it for what is ostensibly just a story about a bunch of kids on a magical island. And I feel like Pan doesn't do a very good job of capturing that. It lacks the heart of a lot of the other Pan versions. But that being said, the film doesn't lack necessarily an imagination. Any movie that can have things like, say, a pirate ship that flies that's fighting a bunch of World War II Spitfire planes above a blitzkrieg London, or having a bunch of mining pirates who sing Nirvana, like, I knew about the Nirvana thing going in, and as ridiculously just stupid and out of place it was, apparently it was a last minute addition because the cast of the actual pirates they got were actually singing Nirvana songs, and Joe Wright decided to keep it in. Strangely enough, it's one of those moments that, even though it doesn't fit at all and has absolutely nothing to do with Peter Pan or any of the mythos, it actually works in its own context. There's just such an energy to that scene. It's the combination of sort of this faux singing, chanting from the pirates, where it's sort of like being in this amazing concert, and then you got Hugh Jackman coming out as Blackbeard, and it's photographed and edited and shot in a way that feels a lot like a rock concert. Like, Hugh Jackman comes out and all the pirates are just cheering, and he's, screaming about, "Welcome to Neverland!" And it's like, there's just so much energy in it, and you forget for a moment, wow, this has absolutely nothing to do with anything, and most of the kids in the audience are going to have no idea what this is referencing, but as a sort of standalone moment, it's bizarrely kind of awesome. And there's a lot of little things like that in Pan, which made the film endear itself to me more than really my critical faculty should allow. Because for all intents and purposes, it does fail at what it wants to be. But in terms of its own entertainment value, I found a lot that I really liked in here. The set pieces, as I just mentioned, are a lot of fun. We get the full gamut, from flying ships, to mines, to warrior tribes, to giant monsters. It's just really a lot of fun. A lot of the action set pieces have such an energy to them. And well, I always love me a good bit of steampunk in my movies. We rarely if ever see them, which is why I think Pan probably sticks out to me more than it would have otherwise. And even then, the plot on its own merits isn't terrible. It's just, you can tell it's been really chopped up and there's a lot of scenes missing. But it still does a decent job at getting you from point A to point B as Peter travels around the island and starts to grow a little confidence in himself. At the very least, it's not incomprehensible. It's not like they tore out so much that you just can't follow what's going on or stuff happens for no reason. Here, at least, you have the bones of what might happen, even if all the meat's been stripped off. And for the most part, the cast are actually fairly good. Levi Miller as Pan, I wouldn't say he's one of necessarily the best young actors to play Peter. He does have some wooden points, especially towards the end when he gets to talk to a very important person in his life, which I won't spoil. But he actually does succeed at conveying that sort of cheekiness and that sort of sprightliness you'd want from Peter. And I have a feeling that in an alternate reality where there would be a sequel, I think in a second go around Levi could really shine a lot more. Here he's kind of limited by the material because he has to do a lot of the token, "What is this place? Who are you?" bits. And you don't get to see him be as playful as you'd want him to be. But still, he does hold his own, and he does well in a lot of the acrobatic scenes when he's actually there and not a CGI puppet. Hugh Jackman, as I mentioned, is a ton of fun. You can tell he is just chewing scenery. He absolutely loves this, and it's infectious. Rooney Mara, in an ideal world, yes, we would have gotten a Native American actress, and unlike with Lone Ranger, I can't defend this casting decision. But she's not terrible. She still does a decent job at conveying sort of this proud warrior. And Garrett Hedlund. Now, yes, he is basically playing Indiana Jack Nicholson. There's a lot of teeth grinding, a lot of talking about the name's Hook, James Hook, and all that bit. And yes, honestly, it's a little bit rubbish, but at least it's charismatic, which is a lot more than I can say for a lot of performances that I've seen from Hedlund. For those of you who might be new to the channel, I'm not an especially big fan of Mr. Hedlund. A lot of times I consider him the male Christian Stewart. He's just, in the performances that I have seen from him, he just doesn't give that much to the role. Here it felt really silly and hammy, but at least he was having fun with obviously playing this pastiche on like two big 80s actors, and it just kind of worked for me. For all intents and purposes, from an objective standpoint, it's rubbish, but there's just something about it that works. It's kind of like what Hugh Jackman did in Van Helsing, where really, when you get down to it, the character and the performance don't really work that well, but they actually kind of work in their own stupid context. And then there's the guy whose name I can't remember, but he was in 4 Lions as one of the idiot terrorists who plays Smee here. I actually thought he was really good. He conveyed sort of that childlike quality, but also that weaseliness that sort of you'd expect from Smee. A lot of the kid actors, when they were around, were actually fairly good, I thought. And just everyone else, like the pirates and the various warriors, you can tell everybody's just enjoying themselves in this sort of big pantomime fantasy. And well, the music by John Powell, while at points it does come dangerously close to overpowering certain scenes and just being too over the top, it does do a good job at conveying that wonderful, free-flowing adventure aspect. It's not as good as the music for, say, Hook, but it's still good stuff in its own right. It still gives you that sense of awe and adventure. In essence, what makes Pan difficult for me to, say, do a proper review on is the fact that, much like, say, Van Helsing or Vampire in Brooklyn or World's Greatest Lover, it's not a film that, from an objective standpoint or a critical standpoint, is all that great, but it's just a film that clicks. So everyone has one. A film that, for all intents and purposes, isn't that great, but you just say, this clicks with me. There's something here that just goes with me, and I end up enjoying it. Not as a great film, but as something that I find fun. Which is why, honestly, it's difficult to recommend Pan. If you're a Pan purist, you might want to steer clear of this until it comes on TV or streaming or DVD, because I question how much you're really going to enjoy this. And if you're just someone who's casually just interested in a big adventure story, you might get something out of it, but again, you have to go in very much with that Van Helsing kind of mindset of just big budget farcical nonsense that does have a degree of imagination in it, and you can tell everyone enjoyed making it. But how much you tolerate that depends on how much you tolerate movies like Van Helsing. If you just are not on board for that, don't bother. You will not like the film at all if that's the case. But if that's your thing, if you don't mind slightly oddball, cheesy, fun rides that are not afraid to just say, well, here we go, then you know what, there's, I think, a lot to like about Pan. It's certainly a film that I will be picking up on Blu-ray, if only just to prove that this thing actually happened. Because let's face it, it's not every day you see Hugh Jackman as a pirate singing Nirvana.